one of the things we haven't talked about yet that constitutes a shared interest that's relevant to what we've been discussing as well is you've written books that are focused on the issue of malevolence, like psychopathy. You wrote 0 Degrees of Empathy. You wrote Science of Evil. And I mean, I'm very interested in malevolence and in cruelty and in psychopathy. Not so much the callousness as the cruelty and the delight in cruelty. And so I'm curious, we only have 15 minutes, but I would like to know first how that interest relates to your other interests, but also maybe you could give us a bit of an insight into your broad conclusions.
Yeah. So first of all, just so that our listeners are not confused, the 2 books that you mentioned are the very same book, but they came out under different titles. In the UK, it's called 0 Degrees of Empathy, and in the US, it's called The Science of Evil.
Oh, okay,
so,
okay.
I wouldn't want people to rush out to the bookstore and buy both books because they'll just discover that as soon as they open it, that it's the same book under 2 different titles. But I start that book with a personal anecdote, which is that when I was 7 years old, my father told me about the Holocaust. You know, I come from a Jewish family, and for many people, the cruelty of the Holocaust is kind of one of the big questions about how could human beings treat one another with such extreme cruelty. You know, and he told me about the gas chambers. He told me about how Jews were subject to human experimentation. And he told me that his first girlfriend's mother had her hands amputated in the concentration camp and sewn on backwards so that her thumb was where her little finger should be and vice versa. So the Nazi doctors were conducting experiments on people out of a fascination with what was possible, trying to break through new barriers in surgery, for example, but without any regard for the patient's or the inmate's subjectivity or feelings. You know, and I got, you know, so this has been a lifelong question for me about cruelty. And often extremes of human cruelty are just dismissed as evil. I say dismissed because, you know, what you often hear in a court of law, a criminal court, is the defendant is evil. That's why he or she committed these acts of cruelty. Whereas for a scientist, I don't feel the word evil really explains what's happened. How was the person able to do that? Whereas I think looking at the idea of empathy and the idea that we may either be born with different levels of empathy, so for genetic and neurological reasons, or we may lose our empathy, perhaps because of social factors, ideological factors. You know, think about the people that flew the planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11, and they believed that they were doing the right thing without much thought for the victims that they were about to create. You know, so I guess that's one answer to your question, is that I thought that if we take the idea of empathy and individual differences in empathy, that might give us more explanatory power into the question of why do some people behave with cruelty and others behave with kindness? Why do some people rush over to help other people when they see a victim in the street? They see an old lady who's fallen down. That the empathy is the impulse to rush over and help, to alleviate somebody else's suffering. And other people will walk by. You know, the so-called bystander effect in social psychology. You know, they can almost switch off their empathy. So that's one reason why I got into that and wrote that book. But also, and I was just starting to explain, when you look across the range of disabilities and conditions in psychiatry, whether we're talking about autism or psychopaths, empathy seems to be it comes up a lot. It seems to be something that crops up a lot across people with different diagnoses. And I really wanted to kind of explore in a single book how different aspects of empathy can result in different outcomes. So in the case of autistic people, they seem to have very good affective empathy. They care about others, but they have challenges in cognitive empathy. That's to do with the recognition part, interpreting or inferring what someone might be thinking or feeling. Once it's pointed out to them, they care about another person, and they want to stand up for justice. They want to help people. The psychopath almost has the mirror opposite profile. They have good cognitive empathy. We talked about this a bit earlier. That's how they can deceive others and make you believe that something's true when it's not. But they don't seem to care about others. So they've got reduced affective empathy, and that's how they're able to torture their victims, for example, without caring.
I read a study recently that showed that there was substantial variation in periaqueductal gray activation in people when they were observing the suffering of others. And so periaqueductal gray activation seems to be pretty tightly associated with the experience of pain. And so part of that empathy could be something as direct as, when I see you in pain, what I experience is a pain-like response. And you could imagine wide individual variation in that. And so let me turn that a little bit, because there's a tough question lurking here too, which is, it seems to me likely that what you're pointing to is the relationship between the capacity for cruelty or callousness and lower levels of empathy. Now, it's one thing to walk by an old lady who's fallen down on the street and not help, and it's another thing to kick her, right? And so mere lack of empathy doesn't seem to me to suffice for positive cruelty. But then I'm also curious, you've contrasted systemizing and empathizing, and I think maybe you already answered this with regards to your distinction between affective and cognitive empathy, but there is evidence that lower empathy might be associated with callousness. You'd see also that with agreeableness, by the way. That's mirrored in the trait research. But is there indication that systemizing is associated with more callousness, or is that merely a matter of that cognitive empathy blindness, so to speak?
Exactly. I think it's more the latter. So when we were talking earlier, I was presenting this idea as if empathy and systemizing are two independent dimensions.
Yes.
So in the way I've kind of tried to explain this in my work, I literally plot, empathy along the y-axis and systemizing along the x-axis, and you can find all of us fall somewhere. All of us fall somewhere in that space in the four quadrants, but we do find a small but significant inverse correlation. There's a kind of trade-off that the higher your empathy, the more difficulty you have on systemizing, and vice versa. Obviously, it's true that you can find very empathic systemizers and very systematic empathizers. But nevertheless, the population isn't randomly distributed. We tend to kind of, we said earlier that more women tend to be up and towards the empathy end of those two distributions, and more men tend to be leaning more towards or located more towards the systemizing end of those two distributions. I think when we think about autistic people, as I said, they don't tend to be callous. They tend to they tend to struggle with understanding other people. And so, some of them even avoid other people. They're not out to hurt others. They may just retreat into the predictable world of objects and systems. The child who's playing with their Lego is a kind of almost a stereotype of an autistic child. They're not actively seeking to hurt others. But what you were describing, where somebody goes over and actually kicks the old lady, that's not just low empathy. There's some kind of pleasure in hurting another person. So obviously we need to factor in more than just empathy. that if you're a child, for example, who's been bullied, and it makes you feel bigger and stronger to bully others. We have this phenomenon where the victim turns into a victimizer, which has always been a paradox for psychiatry. Why is it that that kids who know what it feels like, who know how painful it is to be on the receiving end of child abuse, for example, when they grow up, might abuse their own kids? And it's not deterministic. It's not that they all do that.
In fact, most of them don't, right? Most people who are abused as children don't grow up to abuse their children, although most people who abuse their children were abused as children.
So there are these really interesting, important developmental sort of effects that we need to understand. If you do engage in cruelty like child abuse or hurting others, is it just a lack of empathy, or is it that it's actually the activity itself is giving you